Welcome to our 7th film in our virtual Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival and webinar. My name is Neil Popish. I'm the program director with the JCC, a division of Jewish Nevada. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. Special thanks to the Robinson and Frankoff families for their sponsorship and dedication to Jewish films. I also want to thank Joshua Abbey, the director of the Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival, for this great partnership we have formed over the past 7 months. I'd like to thank all of our sponsors. They're listed on your screen. There are too many to mention, but please I would like to acknowledge all of our sponsors who are up on the screen for their participation. We hope you have enjoyed the series of films and webinars that have followed. Please visit the newly updated Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival website at www.lvjff.org. That's www.lvjff.org for updates and links to past webinars. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch starting tomorrow on the Jewish Nevada YouTube page. Once our Q&A with our panelists is finished, I will then ask questions from our participants. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We will ask as many questions as the time is allotted. I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Justice Raquel Montoya-Lewis. She's the first Native American justice to serve on the Washington State Supreme Court. She has served as Superior Court Judge for Wadham County until her appointment to the Washington State Supreme Court in December of 2019. She also served as an appellate judge for the Nisqually tribe and the Northwest Intertribal Court System. Her work as a tribal court judge spanned 15 years. We also have Professor Andrew Woolford, a Ph.D. and a professor of sociology and criminology and former president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Much of his current research is centered in the field of genocide studies, with specific emphasis on cultural techniques of group destruction deployed against indigenous peoples of North America. As always, also joining us is Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival, Joshua Abbey. Joshua.
I'm here. Greetings, everyone.
It's on you.
I would like to welcome our remarkable guests. This is going to be a very important conversation, and I'm grateful to all of those who are in attendance for participating. I'd like to start us off by asking Justice Montoya-Lewis to give a land acknowledgement, and perhaps you can also explain what that means.
I'd be happy to. Welcome, everyone, and I'm glad to be here. I will start off our conversation with a land acknowledgement, and for those of you who haven't experienced that before, that's something I've noticed over the last 15 years. It's become more and more common to begin events and meetings just to give a moment to consider the land on which you sit and the people who came before you. So I'll start off today by just asking that we all acknowledge that wherever we are, if you are within the United States, you are standing on land that many Native people consider to be occupied land. In where I sit today, I am in Washington State, near Olympia, Washington. This land, prior to the settlers coming into Washington, to this part of the country, was occupied by the Coast Salish people. There are a number of tribes in this area who were stewards of this land, and I want to give my thanks to them for caring for this land so that those of us who are here now are able to be a part of this land and this community. So I would just invite you, wherever you are, to give some consideration to where you are at this time. And I just note that there is someone in the chat who's acknowledging where the tribes that she's at. If you're interested in looking, I'm just going to put in the chat now a link to nativeland.ca, where you can put in your address, and it will tell you what tribes inhabited that part of the country and who is there now. So I invite you to do that. And again, I want to thank the Coast Salish people for allowing us to be guests on their land at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we jump into a discussion about the film and the history of the Indian schools and their implications and the greater impact of the Genesis on Native peoples, I would also like to ask you, Justice Montoya-Lewis, to just reflect briefly on the passing of Justice Ginsburg. And for those in our audience who are not aware, that you also have some Jewish roots in your family, how your Jewish experience has informed your Native people's advocacy.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do that reflection. And I'll just start off by saying last Friday at about 4:30, my phone just erupted with people telling me the news. And over the course of the next several hours, part of my work one of the things that I think is really important is to be someone who's willing to be a mentor to young people, law students included, and young lawyers. And I got a number of texts and emails from them asking me, what now? What next? And I have given that a lot of thought. In my tribe, we don't speak of someone who's passed for a number of days between their passing and the start of our traditional ceremonies. But I thought it was important to I guess, break that rule in order to answer those questions that were asked of me. Justice Ginsburg was a visionary. She was able to see a path to what she believed was her life's work in terms of developing the law around the equal protection, the rights of equal protection and equality around gender issues, and then that expanded from there. She saw a path to doing that where others did not, and she was able, over the course of her career, to continue to walk this brand new path and developing the law in all kinds of ways. And what I think about when I think about that is that I don't think Justice Ginsburg would want us to lose hope in her vision, even though we have lost her as a visionary. And so what I said to my law clerks, the other young lawyers and young law students who spoke to me about losing her, is that it's our job, I think, to honor her memory by forging our own paths and having our own visions, and recognizing that the work she did as a visionary is something that can help us to see what's possible. And I see that in the many reflections I've seen about her over the course of today, as she has laid in repose at the U.S. Supreme Court. In terms of the connection of my Jewish roots and my Native roots, and growing up as both Jewish and Native, in a sense, I never really thought of them as being separate. There are so many things that are things that are sort of similar traditions. The sense of humor, Native people communicate through humor. I've worked with over 25 tribes now, and my first job when I work with a new tribe is to figure out how they're funny, and to figure out how to communicate in their sense of humor, because the sense of humor from my tribe to another tribe is really different. That's the same on the Jewish side of my family. Everyone is really funny. We get together and it's just a constant laughter, and often a very dark kind of humor that I think comes from our histories. And so those things are really similar for me, as well as traditions around food and sharing food. And what I don't just mean about sitting around a table and sharing food with others, but I mean sharing in a broader sense, that if there is someone without, that if you are someone who has, that you share that. So those things for me have always been connected, and in terms of how it's informed my work, you know, I think that it is part of my responsibility and actually my obligation, both as a Native person and as a Jewish person, to make the world a better place and to serve my communities. And so I'm hopeful that that I'm doing that.
Thank you so much for sharing. I want to open it up now and invite Professor Woolford to join our conversation in relation to the film. So I prepared some questions. Feel free, of course, to jump in and contribute as you wish. First question is, has there been any historical precedent for the systematic psychological, spiritual, and cultural ethnic cleansing that was intended to be achieved through the Indian schools? Professor Woolford?
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you to Justice Montoya-Lewis for land acknowledgement. I also want to acknowledge that I'm here in Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene territory, and in the homeland of the Métis Nation. This is Treaty 1 territory. This has historically been a meeting place at the forks of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, where cultures have come together to share knowledge, to trade, and to engage with one another. So in a way, I feel this place is very symbolic to our conversations that we're having. To answer your question, there's certainly the assimilative programs that took place in the United States, Canada, and other settler colonial nations in the late 1800s are certainly distinct and unique in their own ways. There were historical precedents in the forms of seminary schools that existed in North America prior to this point, and other institutions that were, you know, more sparsely located. They weren't established in a systematic way to try to eliminate indigenous cultures. It's really at the end of the 19th century that you start to see this momentum towards a more systematic, institutionalized system of erasure. But these institutions don't appear out of anywhere. They take influences not just from seminaries, but from places like workhouses, from reform schools that were developing in places like Europe, where a new philosophy towards how to deal with so-called delinquent children was emerging, where delinquents were seen as being corrupted by their families. So the logic was, well, then we have to remove children from their families in order to purify them, to take away the taint of the corruption of their family's influence. So these sorts of logics all influence people like Richard Pratt, who you heard about in the film, to create things that are called schools, but they really are carceral institutions in a way, intended to discipline the young people into labor, into forgetting or removing their cultures, and to destroy their languages, and to give them sort of military training and these other sorts of disciplinary strategies that are at play in these institutions. I should also just say in other genocidal contexts, we also see children being removed from families, Ottoman Turks, those Armenian, Assyrian, and Pontic Greek children who weren't necessarily physically eliminated were often sent to orphanages and other institutions to be educated, to be transformed into Muslims. In Cambodia, children were removed from their families to be socialized into a Khmer Rouge ideology. So it's, targeting children for group destruction is not uncommon, but certainly it takes unique form in North America.
Is it true that two of the motivating factors for the establishment of the Indian schools were that it was actually less expensive to, quote, civilize the native nations than it was to physically eradicate them? And that by erasing their historical and cultural identity, that would help ensure that indigenous people could never try to reclaim their lands through the U.S. justice system?
Would you like me to address that first, or
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm happy to defer. But, well, certainly it is true that you see particularly around the 1870s. Many people are discussing this issue. They're calling it the Indian question or the Indian problem. And this is an issue they feel they've been trying to address through different strategies, like forced removal of indigenous peoples from their territories, like in the long walk you saw in the documentary of the Navajo people. So forced removal, and then of course warfare is being used. But what they're finding is that warfare is extremely costly, the battles are not easy, there's great losses, and also there's a lot of bad press from the warfare, as Indian rights associations on the eastern seaboard are particularly raising concerns about the violence of these battles. So for all these reasons, various leaders start suggesting that we need a new approach, and some even go so far as like Thaddeus Pound to say, who was a US congressman, to say, it is cheaper and better to teach a young Indian to fight than to kill an old one. Or sorry, it's better, I misquoted that. It's cheaper and better to teach a young Indian than to fight an old one. And there was other people like the commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1871, 1872, Francis Amasa Walker, who wrote a pamphlet called The Indian Question, in which he also says we need to isolate indigenous people on smaller reserves. We need to then, pretty much forget about the older ones because they're not changeable, they're not going to change their ways, and focus education on the youth. So you get many different people coming to the same conclusion at this particular point in time. And Richard Pratt is of course one of them, and he starts his experiment in St. Augustine, Florida, at the Fort Marion prison with the captured warriors who he has under his command there.
Justice Montoya-Lewis, from your perspective, what was the psychological and emotional impact of separating young children against their families' will and placing them in boarding schools, not unlike what is happening on our southern border with the immigration detention camps today?
Well, I think as the film talked about, and I think explored in a really important way, the impact is generational. And when, I think when you remove children, while it is traumatic on the children, it's also traumatic on the community that's left behind. The tribal communities that I'm from, those that I've worked with over the course of my career, view those children who they lost to the boarding schools because they didn't come home as a result of dying there, or sometimes being adopted out from those boarding schools into white families. It is not really felt in a distant way, it's felt in this very present way. So I think those things have these long-term impacts on the communities overall, as well as on individual families. And I'll just briefly, if it's possible to turn on screen sharing, I'll show you a photograph at some point this evening of my great-grandmother who was sent to Carlisle boarding school. I have before and after pictures of her time there. I would say that the experience that she had in boarding school, that her children, my grandmother, had in boarding school, and that my father had in his Catholic education, all have resulted in significant impacts to not just me, but the generation I come from. And I related very much to one of I forget his name at this moment, but the person from the Ute tribe, who talked about the loss of language as a result of that long-term project started in the 1800s to wipe out Native people and wipe out, and if that wasn't possible, to wipe out our culture and our language. That's something that happened in my family as well. And my father was very torn about teaching me the Tiwa language, because for him, speaking it resulted in physical abuse. And so it was dangerous for me to know that language. And that's something I feel very deeply, and I think that that's something that is not unique to me.
Justice Montoya-Lewis, I know that you've been a strong advocate for juvenile justice reform in your work. How are some of the achievements that you've seen informed by the Indian school history and experience?
Well, you know, when I think about juvenile justice, I come from the experience of having, the viewpoint, I guess, that children are better at home with their families. And if you come to juvenile justice with that belief, the idea of putting young people into detention, foster homes, therapeutic environments outside of the home seems extreme. Certainly in my career as a judge, there have been times where either that was the only option or sometimes the best option, but I think it's really rare. And over the course of my career, the use of juvenile detention has significantly decreased because others have come to that conclusion and the data supports it. We don't really benefit our children by putting them into detention. And there are other ways where we see much better results by keeping them in the community and at home. So I think that that my personal viewpoint certainly informed the way I looked at juvenile justice policy. And again, I think the data supported the move that that I've seen across the country in terms of a shift in juvenile justice policy.
I don't know if we're able to do the shared screen. Danica, is that possible?
Oh, it looks like I can.
Okay.
I can do it. Can you see it? Carry on. So are you able to see that?
Yeah, I see.
Okay.
The first slide.
So that is so here is my great-grandmother, Mary Perry. And she's with two other people who were taken to Carlisle at the same time as she was. And as I said, all three of them are from the Pueblo of Laguna, which is where my grandmother came from. And I will just try to, I'm having trouble advancing it here. Hang on. And this is the after picture. So this is the picture of those same three people that shows the two boys in military uniforms and my great-grandmother right here, who is dressed in Western attire. And we have many letters that she wrote about her experience. And I think her experience really comports with the experience that you heard in the documentary. Thank you for the opportunity to share that.
Well, she's made a wonderful contribution to the world in bringing you to help us understand these issues. Thank you so much. Dr. Woolford, what are the parallels between the what's called the American Holocaust, the genocide of indigenous peoples of the Americas, the final solution of the Nazi Holocaust, and the ongoing history of global genocide? How do they relate to each other?
Thank you. I'd like to thank Justice Montoya-Lewis for sharing that photo. It's a photo I've seen many times, but now to have a connection to the people and to know someone who's related to the people, and it's just sort of floored me a little bit here. But to answer the question, I think, I like to not necessarily try to draw direct parallels between genocides, because I see genocide as something that's always very particular or specific to the social and historical context. Like genocidal perpetrators typically are reacting to very specific circumstances and trying to enact their end goal, which is the elimination of a target group. So they often transgress all sorts of expectations about how people would act, and that means there's usually some element of uniqueness to every genocidal context. But with that said, I'm also draw a lot on Raphael Lemkin's work in thinking about genocide. Lemkin's both trying to understand genocide as a scholar, but also as a legal practitioner. So he's both trying to understand it as a social phenomena, but to create laws around genocide that can be then applied to prevent genocides from occurring. And he defines genocide as, generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify, and this is the important part, a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. So what I see important there is, his recognition that genocide utilizes different strategies to try to reach its end goals. So perpetrators may use cultural techniques, physical techniques, biological techniques, but often a combination of all three. And certainly in America, we see physical, cultural, and biological efforts to prevent indigenous peoples from continuing to be, as they are perceived, an obstacle to manifest destiny and Western expansion and other such goals of the state. So with that said, I think there are some key similarities and differences we could discuss. Like certainly in the Holocaust, you see the Nazis have a view of Jewish people and Roma people as well as being inherently and biologically impure, so that they can only be destroyed. They can't be recuperated in any way. So there's no sense of using cultural cultural genocide occurs through the destruction of synagogues, and there's other prohibitions against Jewish culture that come into play that I think are important, are an interesting point of comparison that I can't go into too much detail about here. But ultimately, when it reaches its highest intensity, the Jew and the Roma must be destroyed. And you do hear that ideology also expressed in America by people like John Shivington, who expresses in the Sand Creek Massacre that nits make lice, and therefore the community needs to be murdered root and branch. But as we move into this stage of American settler colonialism, where assimilation is used more as the technique of destruction, then there's this idea that parents can be allowed, older indigenous people are allowed to die out, and the children can be focused on as the source of transformation. One last thing I'll point out also, the comparison that's often made by genocide scholars is looking at the ways in which Hitler was himself influenced by the audacity of the American project, and saw it as a way, as a model for his vision of creating Lebensraum in Europe, as well as just the idea that this sort of imperial project can claim lands for people, for your people, for the people you identify with. So I'm happy to elaborate, but I'll leave it at that so I don't eat up too much time here.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to go back to what Justice Montoya-Lewis was describing in terms of the conflict of retaining the native languages in order to perpetuate traditions and the history. We're part of a series of programs featuring Joy Harjo, who is the current Poet Laureate of the United States and the first Native person to have that honor. She's going to be reading from her latest book of poetry, American Sunrise, on the 29th, next Tuesday, and then that's going to be followed up by a book that she edited, which is the first Norton anthology of Native Nations literature, and will be interviewed by Terry Tempest Williams, who in her own right is a big advocate of Native peoples and also of the environment. Joy Harjo says in her introduction to the anthology, quote, "Even as we continue to create and perform our traditional forms of poetry, we have lost many of these canonical oral texts due to the destruction throughout the Western Hemisphere of the indigenous literary field by the loss of our indigenous languages. We were forced to forsake our languages for English and in the civilizing genocidal process. We are aware of the irony for many of us of writing in English, but we also believe English can be another avenue through which to create poetry and poetry in English and other languages can live alongside texts created and performed within our respective indigenous languages. It is the nature of the divided world in which we live. So my question is, where is the balance for the people of the native nations to assimilate appropriately to American society while maintaining their traditions and cultural identity? I know that's a big question.
Yes, absolutely it is. Well, you know, I think it's pretty common for Native people to talk about walking in two worlds. And that's certainly been my experience. My father was a career U.S. Air Force officer, and he really made it important and forefront in my mind to be able to be successful. I had to work harder than the average person to get a quarter of their recognition. To be seen as average, I was going to have to work and be much more than average. And he was right about that. I think that came from his own experience in his work over the course of his career. And I've certainly seen that reflected in my own. And that requires, I think, something of us that results in a certain loss of culture. In my community, at the Pueblo of Isleta, there are cultural events and ceremonies and things that community members are expected to be a part of that sometimes go on for weeks. Sometimes they're, you know, it's all night long. And those are not things, if you're going to have a career like mine as a lawyer, that's possible to participate in at the level that other people in my community have been able to do, because that's been their priority. And so I think that has been a place where I can see, you know, the loss of culture and the impact on my father and the impact on me. And obviously I live in Washington now, not New Mexico, and so there's distance there as well. That said, I think you know, when I made the move from working as a judge in tribal courts and the decision to then move into the Superior Court for the state of Washington, it was a very conscious decision that I thought it was important that there be representation on the state court judiciary, because there were so many Native families who were in the state court system and never saw themselves reflected in any way, shape, or form. And I was told by many people when I sought the appointment to Superior Court, and then I was told again by many people when I sought the appointment to the Supreme Court, that I needed to conform to what, quote unquote, a judge looks like. People say to me, in fact, somebody said to me earlier this week, "You don't look like a judge." You know, people have an idea of what it means to be a judge in our country. And I was told to cut my hair to be taken seriously. I was told to wear my hair in a certain way if I wasn't going to cut it. People suggested I drop the Montoya from my name because I have to sit for election, and that made me seem less electable. And you know, all of those things I think are messages that, you know, kids get at a very early age in Native communities, that if you're going to be a part of society, you have to leave behind those things that make you Native. And my decision early on in my career was, I'm going to be my whole self. And if that's not something that results in my, you know, success in the mainstream world, I was okay with that. And, you know, I think I've been lucky that I've been able to be as successful as I am and retain who I am and that connection to my community, and to make that a part of my work. But it's not easy, and I hear from young Native people all the time how difficult it is. And I think that's just an ongoing struggle, and I appreciate very much what Joy writes about when she talks about that, because that has absolutely been a part of my experience. When I moved from tribal courts to state courts, I left a lot of our tribal definitions of justice behind, because that's not a part of the system in which I now work. I think it's a trade-off, and I think we all have to make decisions about how much of that trade-off we're willing to make.
I just need to say that your authenticity is tremendously encouraging and very much appreciated.
Thank you.
For both of you, is there a proper reconciling and redress of Native nations and justice that will have a moment like the civil rights and Black Lives Matter movements have had? Professor Woolford?
Oh, this is one where, you know, it's hard to, you know, speaking from a perspective within Canada, certainly you can see how slow and arduous the process to reaching reconciliation is, even with the efforts that have been made by survivors here to take the government to court in class action lawsuits to force them into the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement that brought us the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of which, you know, there's 94 calls to action that the Commission gave to the Canadian government and multiple levels of government, and Canadians more generally, that need to be realized to bring us on a pathway towards reconciliation in their estimation. And we haven't achieved many of these yet. But certainly there are some small glimmers of hope now that when I go into my class and I talk about you know, settler colonialism and its impact in Canada and the United States, my students don't resist to the same level. They come to class with some level of awareness of what's happened. So maybe there's some general opening up that means the conversation can get started. In the US context, I mean, you've got multiple original sins at the basis of the foundation of the country with slavery and settler colonialism, and how they will be addressed and in what order. But I feel pretty confident when I read the work of Indigenous scholars and see Indigenous activists that this issue is going to not be let to lie low, that it's going to be brought to the forefront in some way. But you know, ultimately, for reconciliation to occur, I think those people who have been wronged have to see some respect, some mutual effort on the side of those who are in the settler population to be more accepting, to be more open, but, you know, in general, to rethink the ways in which settler colonialism influences how our nations operate on many different levels still, and continues so. So I'll leave it at that.
Justice Montoya-Lewis, do you see signs like the protest in South Dakota as an indication that there can be more of a visible reconciling?
I guess I have mixed feelings about that. I think those kinds of protests have been going on since first contact, and for reasons that I'm not sure I can identify. You know, the pipeline protest got a lot of media attention, but that protest had been going on before that media coverage. It's been going on since. And, you know, I was recently, before we were unable to travel due to COVID, I was in Spokane and I visited with a number of tribal members, and several of them were working on issues related to uranium mining and the impact of that on communities in Washington. And I was reminded of people that I know have been working for decades on those same issues on Dene land in Arizona and New Mexico. For whatever reason, that doesn't get the same level of media attention, but the protests associated with that, the harm that those kinds of things have caused, have been ongoing. So I think that, you know, our resistance, for want of a better word, has been a part, and our activism has been a part of our communities, as I said, since first contact. So some of that for me is about who's paying attention and who wants to pay attention to those voices. And I think it's been my experience that people are very interested in hearing the Native experience if it confirms their stereotypes about who Native people are. and it makes them feel comfortable. When we're talking about things that make people feel a little less comfortable, people are not as interested. And I think that those kinds of protests make people very uncomfortable. Although I agree with Professor Woolford that in my experience working with young people and teaching, when I taught for up until about 5 years ago at the university level, there absolutely has been a change certainly since I was in college, and a much more of an acceptance and interest in that. But as I said, I think it's much more of a question of people's interest in hearing that viewpoint, and not so much about whether or not that viewpoint is being shared. It's really more about whether it's being heard.
I have to acknowledge the significance of Joy Harjo's appointment to the U.S. Poet Laureate. I think that's a pivotal juncture in helping to improve and raise the awareness, and she's done just remarkable work in that regard. And I encourage everybody to please, if you can, join in when she reads from her work next week and to learn more about her. Okay, we're going to end on a philosophical note, because if we haven't already visited big issues in that realm. My question is, in the settler colonial context of manifest destiny, how does the so-called benevolent education of the dominant society's cultural capital imposed upon the conquered victims' cultures diminish the potential of civilization and humanist idealisms or idealism? Can cultures learn to embrace our distinguishing natures without justifying themselves through the destruction of other cultures? Professor Woolford?
Yeah, that is a very big question. You know, one of the things why I draw upon Raphael Lemkin's work so much is that his reason for creating this notion of genocide was in part because he had an ideal vision of that groups possess their own genius. Each group possesses their own forms of knowledge, their ways of seeing the world, that are really a resource for global humanity. That by just trying to destroy culture, eliminate culture, we are actually eliminating something that's part of our collective wealth as humanity. And I think the more that I've been immersed within this research, and the more I've worked with residential school survivors and elders, and I've learned about indigenous languages, the ways in which I've been forced to shift my thinking out of a settler colonial mindset that's been very much ingrained since the day I was born, and just seeing the land differently, or seeing animals or the river, or seeing relationships between people, and what honesty and trust mean. These things I think are real gifts that we have to share, and by simply suggesting that this very narrow issue of benevolence, that the originators of the boarding school systems, this narrow notion of benevolence may involve making other people be like us, was just simply built walls and closed down all this potential for sharing, for becoming together. People who don't try to dominate, but who can share the world and to our mutual benefit. So,
Justice Montoya-Lewis, in the light of climate change and the environmental degradation, can that possibly help shift our understanding and appreciation of the Native people's profound awareness of the importance of the land and the environment?
I think it's a lot to ask of Native people, given the history that we've been talking about, and that's where I think my comments to your prior question I think are relevant. I think that sometimes people come to us for solutions when they haven't been particularly interested in the problems as we've defined them over decades or centuries. I think this is one of those examples. And so is it possible to learn something from tribal communities who've been thinking about the land in a way, as Professor Woolford described, that's different? certainly. And you know, my experience has been that that state court systems, for example, have a lot to learn from tribal justice systems if they would listen. Most of the time, they're not particularly interested in listening. And I say that now as a representative of a state court system. So, you know, the answer, I think, is equivocal because, again, I think it would be fair for those leaders in tribal communities to say, you're a little late to the party, and perhaps you should have asked us this 100 years ago. And I think that would be a reasonable response. So I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that. I think there has to be some kind of willingness to acknowledge that history before you can really ask those communities to share theirs.
Okay, in our remaining time, thank you for that perspective. It's really important. I would like to open it up to our participants to share their comments and or questions for about 5 minutes before we close out this, this time together. Neil, you're going to edit and choose some of the feedback you've gotten. I'm assuming you have some.
Yes, Josh, we do have a few questions. Our first question comes from Bruce. He's seen various varying estimates, but how many Native peoples were there in the U.S. territory before the genocide, and how many are there today? Does anybody know the answer to that?
I don't. It's a tricky question because it depends how you frame the timeline of the genocide. If it's over 500 years, you know, then demographers have different estimates of what the pre-contact population was until after the arrival, and so I wish I could provide a numeric response.
But it's, I mean, before colonialism of European culture, weren't there some general estimates of the number of native peoples in?
Oh yeah.
And those are in the tens of millions, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I just don't have an exact number at my fingertips, unfortunately.
But statistically, this genocide that we're discussing far outweighs numerically any other genocide in the history of the world, correct?
Yeah, depending, again, when you see its starting date taking place, then certainly numerically, and you know how you factor in disease spread, then it would certainly outpace any other. I mean, I tend not to like to get into numeric comparisons. I don't like to see there being any sort of hierarchy of genocides. For me, as a genocide scholar, they're all abhorrent, and you know, whether it's a small group in the Amazon or, you know, and I also don't like to necessarily homogenize all the indigenous peoples of North America, because I recognize that there's so many different cultures and linguistic groups that were targeted. So, you know, by talking about a mass number like that, then I'm it seems to me to be equating every indigenous group with every other. So I tend to avoid that kind of comparison myself, but if any,
Thank you for making that distinction. That's very informative. Go ahead, Neil.
Justice Montoya-Lewis, I know you answered the question for the person in the Q&A, but I'm also curious. I'm guessing that there are many other folks in this webinar who may be interested about the mural behind you. It's so beautiful. Is there a way you can tell our listeners a little bit more about it?
Sure. It's actually a painting. It's not a mural. It just looks big behind me. But I'll try to dip down so you can see it a bit better. There you go. So this is by an artist named Pablita Velarde, who was a Santa Clara Pueblo tribal member and an artist. And she died, I want to say in the 1980s, but I might be wrong. It might be a little bit later than that. So this is called the basket dance, and the building behind the dancers is the kiva, which is the central location for all religious ceremonies that take place in tribal communities. This one is above ground, sometimes they're below ground. And you can see in the photographs that the women at the front are dressed, you might not remember it, but are dressed very similarly to the clothing that Mary Perry was wearing in the first picture before she went to Carlisle. It's traditional Pueblo dress that they're wearing there. So yeah, that's the story of that. And if you Google Pueblita Velarde, you'll see her other work. The one other thing I'll point out is at the top of the kiva, it's kind of cut off in this background image, but you can sort of see someone sitting that's gray and black or excuse me, gray and white or black and white stripes. That person is called a clown in traditional dances in Pueblo communities, and that person is sort of keeps everybody following the rules. So, for example, if you're visiting the Pueblo and seeing one of these dances, and you happen to take out a camera and take a picture, one of these clowns will come and confiscate your camera. And so they do sort of amusing things, but they're kind of keepers of the traditions.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Rosa would like to know if there are any Native American language courses available so that Native youth can learn or strengthen their respective Native languages. Anybody?
Actually,
Sure,
I just want to jump in quickly in the Nevada context, because the University of Nevada in Reno just started a program, I believe, for the it's either the Paiute or the Shoshone language, which has been a long time in coming and is very well received and engaged with.
Thank you. It's great to know. I do have another question, and I'm sorry if I pronounce your name incorrectly. Shatar, thank you for sharing your wisdom. What are some things people can do to stay motivated in making a difference where they can especially during this time of the pandemic? What are some techniques to stay motivated?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I'll take a quick stab at it. You know, I will start off by saying I think it's really important to recognize that we are all living through not just one trauma, but multiple traumas at one time. And so I think having the expectation of ourselves individually that we should be accomplishing things above and beyond the basics right now is a pretty high expectation of yourself. So I encourage you to be a little bit compassionate in terms of to yourself in terms of what's possible right now. But I think that if you're someone who is energized by that kind of work, I think in terms of techniques to stay motivated, I recommend having a way to communicate with other people who are doing similar kinds of work. My colleagues on the Supreme Court we communicate over Zoom all the time, and some of that is the work, and some of that's commiserating about that work and how difficult it is in this time. I think it is really important to talk about those things honestly and openly, and also to recognize that if you don't have it right now, that's okay. The work will be there.
Thank you.
Professor Woolford, do you want to comment on that in relation to your students?
Yeah, I think in social movements are, involvement in social movements are one way to sort of get the energy through collective action. I mean, we're still sharing in safe distance protest here over different issues, keeping our 6 meters, but making sure we're out in front of our Parliament building to protest various ongoing issues. So, and I think that kind of stuff energizes you when you feel like, even though that one action isn't going to change the minds of everyone, but it allows you to get that energy to keep going, and that's ultimately what it's about. It's a process, and it's something that requires continuing collective action.
Okay, I'm going to close out our session and let our guests get on with their evening. I just have to thank you both sincerely for sharing your profound wisdom and taking the time to communicate through the Jewish Film Festival and through the Joy Harjo online program series. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're going to just go to Professor Woolford's book for those who may want a much more in-depth understanding of this topic. When was this book published, Professor Woolford?
2015, and yeah, so it's 5 years old now, but
it's a great book. I've got a copy, I've read it, and I highly encourage everyone to seek it out. Also, you can find out more about Justice Montoya-Lewis by Googling her name and going to her website. She's very active in many areas that we just scanned the surface of. And do you want to say any closing words, Justice Montoya-Lewis?
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. I want
to let Justice Montoya-Lewis say any closing words. Goodbye.
Yeah, I really appreciate having had the opportunity to talk about these topics, and I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you, and thanks to all of the participants who were willing to spend this time.
Thank you. Okay, Neil, we're going to
I want to
of our coming attractions.
Yeah, thank you, Justice Montoya-Lewis. Thank you, Professor Woolford, and thank you everybody for attending. I also want to just mention a big thank you to Danica Torchin, who's been helping with all of our technical support and putting up some videos and things like that. Our next film in the virtual Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival and webinars will be called Andrei, the Voice of Wine. This is the story of a Russian-born Jew by the name of Andrei Cherischev, who immigrated to the United States and resurrected and saved the Napa Valley wine industry. The film and webinars presented by Southern Grazers Wine and Spirits, Coppola Wines, and Trinchero, and the JCC of Southern Nevada and the Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival. And we will have a webinar discussion on the documentary on Wednesday, October 21st at 5 o'clock, moderated, of course, by Joshua Abbey, and featuring filmmaker Mark Cherischev, the grandnephew of Andrei, and Jeff Morgan, founding winemaker of Covenant Wines, the only winery that makes wine in both California and Israel. We are going to show you a short trailer.
Actually, Neil, can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it possible for Danica to put up the slide of the 3 Joy Harjo events before we start the trailer? The graphic with the picture of Joy and the 3 events. Yeah, there we go. So we've got Tuesday the 29th at 5, Thursday the 1st of October, and you can find the registration links on the Jewish Film Festival website and or Poetry Promise. Just Google Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival or Poetry Promise, and you'll find out more information. Thank you. We can do the preview now, and then we're just going to say goodbye.
I never permitted to open my own internal life to any press or to any press, to anybody who is interested in me as a person.
There is something of the romantic in those who love wine. When the writer Robert Louis Stevenson came here to California's Napa Valley in 1880, he called the wine bottled poetry. But over the next 50 years, the valley fell into decline. Vineyards were left untended, and the vines grew wild. There were a few who refused to let go of the dream. pioneers, misfits and refugees who believed in the valley's rare promise of wines that could challenge the best in the world. Andrei Cherischev was one of them. He often said that in order to produce great wine, the vines needed to suffer and struggle to survive. The same could be said of him.
He was a small person in stature, but he was a giant in terms of the Napa Valley wine.
You can't talk about the real beginning of the great California winemaking without talking about Andrei. He's right at the very core of it all.
He was a great teacher, and he just happened to be the best guy making wine.
It was recommended that we have Andrei Cherischev be our consulting winemaker, and so I first met him. He was very funny and he had a big nose. He was, this is my laboratory, and he would point to his nose.
Definite mischief streak, that he was trying to balance not only the wine, but all the people involved with the wine. You know, he would cheer you up if you were depressed.
You travel with Andrei, it's not just a winery here and there, and then eating and drinking and then getting out of sleep. It is 5 wineries a day, a minimum. You're tasting over 100 wines a day, sometimes up to 300 wineries a day. My notebook looked bigger than the New York phone book.
He made you think, and I think that was important. He challenged you.
He was one of maybe 8 or 10 persons who marked me for all my life.
And he brought a different culture, a different vision, and again a sense of modesty.
Andrei was the pop of the California wine.
I love the earth. I love the creation by Mother Nature. Some people are saying by Great Lord above us.
And a link to see that film will be emailed to each of you tomorrow. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Josh, you have anything to say?
Just thank you very much, Neil. Thank you to the JCC and Jewish Nevada and everyone who's been involved today. All our sponsors, our participants, and our special guests. Have a good evening.